Ireland is a country located west of the UK and won its independence in 1922. However, in the 800 plus years it was occupied, the greatly religion-divided country faced humongous hardships. These hardships forced thousands of Irish citizens to turn to alcohol in order to cope with these tough times. As a result, the Irish gained an international reputation as alcoholists. These are their stories.
The late 12th century marked the start of the British invasion of Ireland and over 800 years of racial oppression. In hopes to In hopes to completely dominate the mostly Catholic Irish, the British Protestants would conquer a region and replace the Irish farmers with loyal British Protestants in a process they called plantation. This is why the province of Ulster in Northern Ireland is known to associate itself with the British and is mostly Protestant. In the late 1600s, the small, poor Catholic farmers and courtiers were being exploited by the wealthy Protestants and subjected to constant humiliation. Because of this humiliation, the oppressed Irish had to cope with the materials they had. Thus, they made alcohol from the crops they grew, potatoes and grain. During this time, 50% of cottages had a Poyton still that could produce 12 gallons of Irish whiskey at a time. What do you call a potato that is reluctant to jump into boiling water? A hesitator.
So the Irish continued enduring and drinking. However, in the early 19th century, land switched from being distributed among a father's sons equally to only going to the firstborn male. As a result, there was a huge population of unemployed males that had neither land nor wives, as no father would allow his daughter to marry a landless man. What was most unfortunate for them was that Irish machismo was determined by land ownership and marital status. Needless to say, the large unemployed male population had no machismo. Yet, in a turn of events, they turned to the two things that were available to them, violence and alcohol. Thus started a distinctive shift in Irish culture in which manliness was determined by tolerance to alcohol and physical pain. Despite the fact that Ireland was now filled with violent, drunk, rowdy young men, the community accepted this behavior, knowing the hardship and struggles the young men were trying to forget and the hardship and struggles that they had yet to endure.
Go.
Here we have an example of an authentic Irish bar found in a traditional American home. Bars, or pubs as they're often called, come from the word public, as the majority of poorer Irish could not afford to socialize in the private establishments used by the rich. Now, this pub is owned by my good friend, Seamus O'Donoghue. Seamus, what can you tell us about your pub?
Now, the pub is the center of socialization in Ireland. It is where friends will come to meet and catch up and chat. What is drunk here is mostly whiskey and Guinness. Guinness being an adored beer founded in 1756 and is so loved it can actually be bought internationally.
Now, in the 20th century, the British actually outlawed pubs, so many pub owners converted their bars to hardware and grocery stores. These spirit grocers can still be found in Ireland today, and many times when you go out for some ushkeba or Irish whiskey, you can also get a hammer and nails.
In Irish pub culture, it's tradition for everyone in the group to buy a round. So since there are three of us, we'd be having 3 rounds.
Actually, that's not quite right, because you can only get your rounds in even numbers. Or, as the old Irish saying goes, a bird can't fly without one wing.
30.
Or, as the old Irish saying goes, a bird can't fly with only one wing. So we would actually, in fact,
have to invite someone else into our group to get our rounds to an even number. Or we could even ask the bartender. And while the bartender, or we could ask someone else into our group, even the bartender. And while the bartender would not explicitly drink with us because he's on duty, he could act as a placeholder in that case.
Well, Connor, it's a good thing that pubs are so popular because there's just so many people we can invite to drink with us. Did you know that this popularity probably stems from the great atmospheres that pubs have? I mean, they've even gone international. Any country, you can find a pub to drink with some friends. I mean, the joy that the poor folk, the joy that the poor folk bring has just really created a sanctuary in these pubs.
It's like a second home.
Please, the pub is like the first home. Where you sleep is like the second home.
Tradition!
Tradition!
What's wrong with
Stop! Drugs, unlike elsewhere in the world, are extremely looked down upon in Ireland, whereas alcoholism is seen as much more acceptable. Alcohol is seen as much more acceptable in Ireland, and you will find uses of weed, cocaine, heroin, Molly, PCP,
6 hours later.
ecstasy, speed, right? You'll see that they're actually seen in a much more negative light than alcohol is. And what's interesting is that one of the terrible double standards that is prevalent in Ireland is that it is extremely socially acceptable for women to drink with the men. However, if women are alcoholics, that's seen as much worse than if men were alcoholics, because the society in Ireland, especially during the times in which they were suffering from English oppression, which men were seen as having to endure more of the struggles, and thus it was more acceptable for their alcohol use rather than women's.
In Ireland, in the mid-19th century, the 1800s, Father Theobald Matthew led a movement to abstain from alcohol. This movement was immensely successful, as hundreds of thousands of Catholics began to be sober. In 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed, which repealed the Test Acts and Penal Acts, which degraded Catholics, forcing them to use different utilities. There was public segregation, unfair pay, etc. And these were still a part of England until 1922 and created a lot of tensions that even still existed in the 1960s.
One of the most historically well-known and tragic events that ever occurred in the country of Ireland was the Irish Potato Famine. This occurred between the years 1845 and 1852. In the Irish Potato Famine, the British, who were currently established in the country of Ireland, sacked all of their crops. This took an enormous toll on the lower-class population during this time. The population of Ireland quickly diminished. As there were only a few million people living on the island during this time, the population plummeted. As a result, many Irish citizens were forced to migrate to North America simply in order to survive. In America, they were subject to even more racial discrimination and injustice than they were in the country of Ireland. This forced a lot of the Irish population to turn to alcohol once again in order to cope with their depression, and they were forced to give up the abstinence that they had worked so hard to achieve. This is why, oftentimes in the United States, Irish immigrants are pinned as being drunks and alcoholics, simply because of their result of turning back to this past tendency. Additionally, the Irish who remained in Ireland were so depressed due to the current conditions there and lack of food overall that they too turned back to alcoholism. This is the overall result of the potato famine. This is considered a genocide on behalf of the British,